This is music, and this is God's creation, but it also kind of isn't God's creation. I realized that it's been quite a while since I made a Tapeworm Terror episode, so let's just get to it. In this episode, we're going to have a look at an authentic, genuine demo tape from the early 90s, from the underground scene in Odense, Denmark. We're going to have a look at God's Creation by Kourage, or Kourage. I think they actually called themselves Kourage. God's Creation. But in a way, it actually isn't God's creation. So we'll get to that in a minute or two. If you look at the tape itself, you will see that the label has obviously been manually cut out and stuck to a black cassette tape shell here. And the writing on the labels has been produced using a typewriter. So that's quite do-it-yourself. The J card itself looks like this, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that this might be some early 90s blackened speed or thrash metal, or maybe even black metal, but it isn't. It's actually 80s metal, written, performed, recorded in 93. God's Creation. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that it's obviously printed in color: red, blue, black. Back in the early 90s, most of us could not afford hiring a professional printer to do that sort of stuff. Or most of us wouldn't have access to professional printing gear, but these guys had. So what we would normally do is we would Xerox the cover artwork and manually cut it out from the sheet of paper and make J-cards like that. Not these guys. They hired a printer, or maybe one of them worked as a printer and had access to printing equipment. The inside is quite simple. You have a track list just like this. And if you take a closer look at it, you can see that up here. The track list is a sticker that has been stuck to the inside of the J card. And you can perhaps even see through the sticker an alternative track list, and also down here some credits. So what happened, I think, was they released a demo earlier called God's Creation. Maybe they spent a lot of money on the J card. Maybe they had surplus J cards. So when the time came for the next demo, this one here, they just released that as God's Creation 2 using the exact same J card. And then they just produced a new track list on stickers and stuck that to the inside of the track list. That's why this is God's Creation, but kind of isn't God's Creation. The original God's Creation had a song called God's Creation on it. This one doesn't. This one has 5 songs called Sign of Hell, Ride to Heaven, Ticket to Hell, that's on side A. Side B, you have Buried Alive and In the Dead of Night. So no song called God's Creation. But, I mean, this sticker, I think maybe you can see it on the label, says God's Creation down here. So that's also called God's Creation. But it's not God's Creation, but it is. Very confusing. So what are we dealing with? As I said, we're dealing with traditional 80s metal with a good dose of hard rock and elements of glam rock, glam metal as well. So when I listen to these 5 songs, what I think of is Turbo era Judas Priest, Accept, a Motley Crue, AC/DC, 80s AC/DC, and just old school 80s heavy metal. So there's a lot of 80s metal riffage. You have some hard rock riffage. You have some sort of like up tempo, Mob Rules kind of songs. You have some mid-tempo, straight up 80s metal songs. You have some hard rock riffs being injected every now and then. And you know, it's pretty good stuff. I think I enjoy listening to this for sure. But the most interesting song to me is "Buried Alive," the opener on side B, which opens up with a riff that sounds a lot like a slowed down version of one of the Motley Crue iconic riffs. I'd like to say "Looks That Kill," but I could be wrong. Just slowed down. You have some pretty cool just metal riffs going on, some pretty cool hard rock elements injected in this song, and a really, really cool just straight up doom metal bridge. And really, it's kind of like I would say a mix of traditional heavy metal and doom metal, just this song "Buried Alive." But then it has in the bridge the weirdest boogie rock call response section I've ever heard. Just so slowed down boogie rock riffage, and the lead vocalist sort of enacting, singing of course, the character that's buried alive, singing about how he's in pain and he needs help and blah blah blah. And then the response part, the sort of the choir, is just voices mocking him, calling him an asshole at some point. Very weird bridge in the middle of an otherwise pretty cool kind of doomy song. But yeah, we're dealing with, I would say, quite enjoyable 80s metal. Pretty good stuff in my opinion. I quite like these guys back in the early 90s, but they had a bit of a rough deal, to be honest, because early 90s, part of the underground metal scene. In 93, by that point, the underground metal scene in Odense had gone all extreme metal. It was black metal, death metal, thrash metal, which was considered part of the extreme metal scene at that point. Death doom, all that stuff, right? And then you had these guys doing 80s metal. So they had a raw deal. When they did sort of gigs with the rest of the underground metal scene, hardly anyone showed up for their gigs. But they did have kind of like their own ecosystem. They were quite popular with the biker crowd. So when they did their own shows, headlining, they actually had quite a lot of people showing up. And I do remember one show they played, I think it was in a place called Badstuen in Odense. And at some point, two members of the audience had gone in sort of into a kerfuffle. One guy had really, I think, provoked the other guy. And the guy that provoked the other guy was quite small. And I think at some point he realized the other guy was like towering, a hulk. So he got scared. The small guy ran up on stage. He thought that was where he was safe. In the middle of a song, he wasn't. The big guy just went on stage, sucked him right in the face, just punched him, knocked him out, and then went back into the audience. And it was literally hold my beer. And then when he went back, started drinking his beer, and the small guy got carried off stage. The band were obviously used to this. They didn't flinch at all. They finished their song, and then when the song was done, one of them said, "Hey, if you want to fight in here, go outside." So they just made a joke of it. I also once, I don't even remember how, some of my friends and I ended up at a party in the rehearsal room. And it was just full of bikers and, so-called biker chicks. It was a very strange environment. I wasn't used to that, being from, thrash metal and extreme metal background. So that was interesting. But yeah, God's Creation, kind of, but kind of not, by Kourage. Traditional 80s metal from the early 90s. And I think this is a very, very cool kind of just gem to have in your collection if you like heavy metal. Fun stuff. So that was this episode of Tapeworm Terror. Had a look at God's Creation, maybe, by Kourage. A genuine, traditional 80s metal demo tape, but it's from 93. Go figure. Thanks for watching.